July 4th, 1944, Saipan. The cave smelled of salt and fear. 32 women crouched in the volcanic darkness, children pressed against their chests. Outside, the jungle burned. Shells whistled overhead. Voices, American voices, echoed through the smoke. One woman clutched a grenade. Another held a sharpened stick. They had been told what would happen if they surrendered. Torture, rape, death. The Emperor's voice still rang in their ears. Death before dishonor. Boots crunched on gravel. A shadow appeared at the cave mouth. A young Marine, no older than 20, stepped into the light. He raised his hands, empty, no weapon drawn. Behind him, a Japanese-American translator spoke softly in their language. "You are safe. No one will hurt you." The women stared. This was not what they had been promised. This was not the monster they were told to fear. One woman began to weep. Another dropped the grenade. It rolled across the stone floor, unarmed. What happened next would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. For over a decade, the Japanese Empire had cultivated a carefully constructed narrative. Through schools, radio broadcasts, military training, and neighborhood associations, a single message echoed across the home islands and occupied territories. The Western powers were barbarians. Americans, in particular, were portrayed as demons, violent, lawless, godless, intent on desecrating Japanese honor and purity. Women heard this message most intensely. In a culture built on rigid codes of duty and shame, female honor was considered sacred. Mothers were told that enemy soldiers would defile their daughters. Wives were warned their husbands' sacrifices would mean nothing if they fell into American hands. Teachers instructed schoolgirls that capture meant a fate worse than death. Surrender was not an option. It was betrayal of family, of emperor, of the very soul of Japan. This indoctrination was not abstract. It was visceral, repeated, and total. By mid-1944, the war had turned catastrophic for Japan. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, drawing closer to the homeland with each landing. Saipan, part of the Mariana Islands, was a critical defensive position. Losing it would place Japanese cities within range of American B-29 bombers. The stakes were existential. Over 30,000 Japanese troops defended the island. But Saipan was not just a military garrison. Nearly 25,000 civilians lived there. Japanese settlers, Korean laborers, and indigenous Chamorro and Carolinian people. Families had farms, schools, shrines. Children played in the shadow of Mount Tapachau. Women tended gardens near the cliffs overlooking the sea. When the Americans invaded on June 15, 1944, the battle was ferocious. Naval bombardment tore through coastal defenses. Marines stormed ashore under withering fire. Japanese forces fought with suicidal determination, launching banzai charges that left the beaches soaked in blood. Civilians fled inland, deeper into the jungle, into caves carved from volcanic rock. And with them, they carried the fear. Military loudspeakers had been blaring warnings for days. Leaflets dropped from planes urged surrender, but Japanese officers intercepted them, calling them lies. Soldiers told families that the Americans would slaughter every man, rape every woman, and enslave every child. Some distributed grenades to civilians. Mothers were handed explosives and told it was mercy. By early July, the island was collapsing. Japanese command knew defeat was inevitable. But rather than allow mass surrender, officers encouraged mass suicide. Families gathered at the northern cliffs. Fathers pushed children off the edge. Mothers followed. Entire bloodlines ended in seconds, choosing death over dishonor. In the caves, those who remained faced an impossible choice: emerge and face the monsters, or die in the darkness. The American military had not anticipated this level of civilian tragedy. Marine Corps commanders on Saipan were trained for combat, not mass psychological trauma. Yet, as they advanced through the jungle, they found caves filled with terrified families, cliffs stained with blood, and beaches littered with the bodies of women and children who had chosen death over surrender. It was a horror that shook even battle-hardened soldiers. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention in 1929, committing to humane treatment of prisoners of war. While the agreement primarily covered military combatants, American policy extended protections to civilians caught in combat zones. Internment camps were to provide food, shelter, medical care, and safety. Abuse was prohibited. Dignity was to be maintained. This was not propaganda. It was doctrine. Field manuals issued to Marines and Army personnel explicitly outlined proper conduct toward prisoners. Officers were instructed to separate combatants from non-combatants, provide immediate medical attention to the wounded, and ensure women and children received priority care. Military police units were assigned to manage internment facilities. Interpreters, many of them Japanese-American soldiers from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and Military Intelligence Service, were brought in to bridge the language gap. But doctrine was one thing. Reality was another. The challenge was not just logistical. It was psychological. How do you convince someone to trust you when they have been taught their entire life that you are evil? How do you offer help to a mother clutching a grenade, believing she is protecting her child by killing them both? American forces began deploying surrender teams. These units, often led by Nisei translators, would approach caves and fortified positions with loudspeakers. They spoke in Japanese, using calm, reassuring tones. They promised food, water, safety. They urged families to come out. Some did. Many did not. On the northern cliffs, later named Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, soldiers watched helplessly as hundreds leapt to their deaths. Some tried to intervene, shouting, reaching out, but language and distance made it impossible. One Marine later recalled seeing a woman throw her infant off the cliff, then jump herself. He said he could not sleep for weeks. Yet even amid this tragedy, a shift was beginning. Those who did surrender, either out of desperation or exhaustion, were taken to hastily constructed internment camps near Charan Kanoa. They arrived expecting brutality. What they found instead would challenge everything they had been told. Tents were erected. Rations were distributed. Medics treated wounds without discrimination. Children were given candy. Mothers were allowed to stay with their families. And slowly, disbelief began to replace fear. The lies were everywhere. In schoolrooms, teachers described Americans as savages who wore necklaces made of Japanese teeth. In newspapers, cartoons depicted U.S. soldiers as ape-like creatures with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts claimed that captured women were paraded naked through enemy camps, subjected to unspeakable humiliations before being executed. These were not fringe beliefs. They were institutional. The Senjin-kun, the Japanese military's code of conduct, explicitly stated that capture was the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers were expected to die fighting. Civilians were expected to follow the same logic. A woman who surrendered was considered tainted, her family's honor destroyed. Even if she survived, she could never return home with dignity intact. One survivor, interviewed decades later, recalled her mother's final words before the invasion. "If the Americans come, we die together. Do not let them touch you." She was 12 years old. This indoctrination created a psychological trap. Surrender was not simply a tactical decision. It was spiritual suicide. To live as a prisoner was to betray ancestors, emperor, and self. Death, by contrast, was noble, honorable, pure. So when American forces approached, many chose annihilation. The women who emerged from the caves did so in stages. First came the wounded, too weak to resist. Then the elderly, who had seen enough death. Finally, the mothers, driven out by starvation and the cries of their children. They expected execution. Instead, they were met with silence. Marines stood at a distance, weapons lowered. Medics approached slowly, hands visible, speaking softly, even when the words were not understood. Water was offered, Food was placed on the ground. No one rushed. No one grabbed. One woman later described the moment she realized she was not going to die. A soldier knelt down. He smiled. He gave my daughter a piece of chocolate. She ate it. He did not hurt her. I did not understand. The confusion was profound. These were not the monsters from the broadcasts. They were young men, exhausted, dirty, many of them barely older than boys. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked sad. None looked like killers. But trust did not come instantly. Many women refused to eat, fearing the food was poisoned. Some clutched their children and wept uncontrollably. Others sat in silence, eyes vacant, waiting for the inevitable violence that never came. The internment camps on Saipan were crude, rows of canvas tents, dirt paths, barbed wire perimeters. But they functioned. Navy corpsmen and Army nurses moved through the camps daily, treating injuries that ranged from shrapnel wounds to malnutrition. Antibiotics were administered. Bandages were changed. Surgeries were performed in field hospitals. This was incomprehensible. In Japanese military culture, the wounded were often abandoned. Resources went to those who could still fight. Civilians received little consideration. Yet here, American medics treated everyone, combatants and non-combatants, men and women, young and old, with the same level of care. Meals were distributed twice daily: rice, canned vegetables, crackers, sometimes meat. It was not luxurious, but it was consistent. Children received milk powder. Pregnant women were given extra rations. Red Cross parcels arrived with soap, toothbrushes, and basic clothing. For many prisoners, this was the first time in months they had eaten a full meal. One woman, a schoolteacher from Garapan, kept a hidden diary. She wrote, "They feed us. They do not beat us. I do not know what to believe anymore. Are they trying to deceive us? Or were we deceived all along?" The question lingered in every tent, every conversation, every quiet moment of reflection. The Japanese military had taught its people that American soldiers viewed women as objects, spoils of war to be claimed and discarded. Rape was presented as inevitable. Survival meant defilement. Yet in the camps, strict protocols governed interaction between male soldiers and female prisoners. Women were housed in separate sections, guarded primarily by female Navy nurses and Red Cross volunteers when available. Male soldiers were prohibited from entering women's quarters without female personnel present. Latrines were segregated. Privacy, as much as could be maintained in a wartime internment facility, was enforced. This separation was not coincidental. American commanders understood that trust would be impossible without it. Violations were punished. One Marine corporal was court-martialed after entering a women's tent without authorization, even though no assault occurred. The message was clear. The rules applied to everyone. Female prisoners noticed. They watched how soldiers kept their distance, how orders were followed, how boundaries were respected. It did not erase their fear overnight, but it planted doubt in the propaganda they had been fed. One woman recalled, "I thought they would come at night. Every night I stayed awake, waiting. But they never came. After 2 weeks, I finally slept." Mothers with infants were given additional considerations. Nursing stations were set up where women could feed their children in private. Diapers, crude but functional, were provided. When supplies ran low, American nurses tore up their own clothing to make bandages and wraps for newborn. These small acts of humanity accumulated. Over time, they became impossible to ignore. Communication was the bridge or the barrier between two worlds. Many of the Japanese-American soldiers serving as interpreters had been born in the United States, children of immigrants who had faced their own struggles with prejudice and displacement. Some had families in internment camps back home, locked away by the same government they now served. Yet they volunteered for the military intelligence service, enduring suspicion from both sides. On Saipan, these Nisei soldiers became lifelines. They translated not just words, but intent. When a Marine asked a mother where her husband was, the interpreter would soften the tone, removing any edge that might sound like an interrogation. When a woman asked if she would be killed, the interpreter responded with patience, not anger, explaining again and again that she was safe. It was exhausting, emotionally draining work. One Nisei interpreter, Staff Sergeant Kazuo Yamane, later wrote in his journal, "I see my own mother in their faces. I hear my grandmother's voice in their questions. How do I convince them that we are not the enemy when they have been told otherwise for so long?" Some prisoners initially refused to believe the interpreters were Japanese. They thought it was a trick, that these men were spies or collaborators. But over time, hearing their own language spoken with familiar accents, seeing men who looked like their brothers and sons treating them with respect, the walls began to crack. Children adapted faster. Kids who had hidden behind their mothers began approaching soldiers, curious about the strange uniforms and equipment. Candy became a universal currency. Chewing gum, chocolate bars, hard candies, small gestures that required no translation. One Marine lieutenant recalled a 5-year-old girl who refused to leave his side after he gave her a piece of gum. She followed him around the camp for hours, chattering in Japanese he couldn't understand. Her mother watched, terrified at first, then quietly weeping when she realized he was simply being kind. For the mothers, nothing mattered more than their children's survival. They had been prepared to kill them to spare them from American cruelty. Now, faced with a reality that contradicted everything they believed, they struggled to reconcile their actions with their instincts. Some withdrew into silence, unable to process the dissonance. Others clung to their children with renewed desperation, as if protection might still be needed. A few began, hesitantly, to let their guard down. American forces understood that winning over the children meant winning over the mothers. Medical staff prioritized pediatric care. Malnourished infants were treated first. Kids with infections received antibiotics before adults. Teachers among the prisoners were encouraged to organize simple lessons, giving children structure and normalcy. Playgrounds, improvised from scrap wood and rope, appeared in the camps. Swings, seesaws, simple games. Soldiers carved toys from driftwood. One Navy carpenter built a dozen wooden dolls, painting faces with whatever materials he could find. The sight of children laughing, playing, running freely. It was a sound many mothers had not heard in months. And it was that sound, more than any words or promises, that began to change minds. One woman later testified, "When I saw my son smile again, I knew we were not going to die. I did not understand why the Americans were kind, but I knew finally that we would live." The shift did not happen all at once. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, a series of small realizations that accumulated until the old narrative could no longer hold. By late July 1944, the camps near Charankanoa held over 10,000 Japanese civilians. Tents stretched across the scorched landscape. Dust hung in the air. The sounds of war had faded, replaced by the mundane rhythms of survival. Lines for food, washing clothes, children playing in the dirt. But something had changed. Women who had refused to speak now asked questions. Where were they being taken? When could they go home? Would their husbands, if they survived, be allowed to find them? The questions themselves were evidence of a psychological shift. You do not plan for the future if you believe you have none. The turning point came in waves, different for each woman, but clustered around specific moments that shattered the remaining pieces of propaganda. For some, it was medical care. A young mother named Hatsuko had given birth in a cave 3 days before surrendering. The infant was weak, struggling to breathe. She believed her child would die, and that she deserved that punishment for failing to follow through with the expected suicide. Instead, a Navy corpsman took the baby to a field hospital. Oxygen was administered. Antibiotics fought off infection. 72 hours later, the corpsman returned the child, alive, wrapped in a clean blanket. Hatsuko did not speak English. The corpsman did not speak Japanese, but when he placed her son in her arms, healthy and breathing steadily, she understood. She bowed deeply, tears streaming, repeating the only English word she knew. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The corpsman later wrote to his wife, "I don't think she expected to see him alive again. Hell, I wasn't sure we could save him either." But when she looked at me, it wasn't with hate anymore. It was something else, maybe hope. For others, The turning point was witnessing consequences. Rumors had spread through the camp about a Marine who had allegedly struck a prisoner during an argument over food distribution. The women expected nothing to happen. In their experience, soldiers were never punished for abusing civilians. But within 24 hours, the Marine was removed from camp duty, formally reprimanded, and reassigned. A translator explained to the gathered prisoners what had occurred and why. Abuse would not be tolerated. Rules applied to everyone. One elderly woman, a former schoolteacher named Fumiko, stood and spoke. "In our country," she said quietly, "soldiers do as they please. No one stops them." The translator relayed her words. An American officer nodded and replied, "Not here. Not in this camp." It was a small moment, but it echoed. Letters became another catalyst. The Red Cross established a system allowing prisoners to send messages to relatives in Japan or other occupied territories, informing them they were alive and safe. Many women hesitated, fearing that admitting survival would bring shame to their family. But desperation won out. Mothers wanted their parents to know their grandchildren lived. Wives wanted their in-laws to know they had not abandoned honor. They had simply chosen life. When replies began arriving weeks later, tearful, relieved, sometimes angry but mostly grateful, the psychological barrier broke further. Families back home were not condemning them. They were celebrating their survival. One letter, read aloud by a translator to a group of women, said, "We heard the island fell. We thought you were dead. Knowing you live is a blessing from the ancestors. Do not feel shame. Come home when you can." Several women wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. The propaganda had told them that surrender meant eternal disgrace. Yet here was proof that their families still loved them, still wanted them, still considered them worthy. But perhaps the most profound turning point came when the women began comparing their treatment to stories they had heard or experienced under their own military. Whispered conversations took place in the tents at night. Women who had fled from Japanese-occupied territories in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia shared their experiences. They spoke of forced labor, confiscated food, brutal punishments for minor infractions. Some had witnessed Japanese soldiers treating local populations with contempt, viewing them as inferior. Korean women, conscripted as laborers and brought to Saipan against their will, were particularly vocal. They had suffered under Japanese occupation for decades. Now, imprisoned by Americans, they found themselves treated better than they had ever been under Japanese rule. The irony was not lost on anyone. One Korean woman named Kim Sun-hee stood before a small gathering and spoke bluntly through a translator. "The Japanese told us the Americans were demons, but I was beaten more by Japanese soldiers in 1 month than I have been touched by Americans in 2. Who were the demons?" Her words hung in the air. Some Japanese women looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded slowly, beginning to process uncomfortable truths about their own nation's conduct. The contrast became impossible to ignore when refugees from the Philippines began arriving at the camps, relocated as the war shifted south. Filipino civilians told stories of Japanese occupation, the Bataan Death March, the Manila Massacre, summary executions, starvation policies. American soldiers listened to these accounts with grim faces. Japanese women listened with growing horror. One prisoner, a young woman named Keiko, later recounted a conversation with a Filipina nurse. "She asked me if I knew what Japanese soldiers had done in Manila. I said no. She told me. I did not want to believe her. But when I saw the pain in her eyes, I knew she was not lying. I felt ashamed, not for surrendering, for believing we were the only victims." By August 1944, the psychological transformation was nearly complete. Women who had arrived expecting torture, rape, and execution now understood they had been lied to. The Americans were not saints. War is never clean, and individual acts of cruelty did occur, but the systematic brutality they had been promised never materialized. Instead, they witnessed structure, discipline, and a conscious effort to maintain humanity even in the chaos of war. Some women began assisting in the camps. They helped distribute food, translated for those who spoke only regional dialects, organized childcare groups so mothers could rest. A few even volunteered to speak on loudspeakers, urging other Japanese holdouts in the hills to surrender, promising them safety. One such broadcast, recorded and preserved in military archives, captures the moment. This is Nakamura Sachiko, formerly of Garapan. I am alive. My children are alive. The Americans have given us food and medicine. They have not harmed us. We were lied to. Please, come down from the mountains. Bring your families. You do not have to die. Her voice cracked with emotion. In the background, children could be heard playing. The broadcast was repeated for days. Slowly, more families emerged. Some came cautiously, hands raised, eyes scanning for threats. Others came collapsing from exhaustion and malnutrition, barely able to walk. All were received the same way, with water, food, medical attention, and the promise of safety. By the time Saipan was declared secure in mid-August, over 14,000 Japanese civilians had been interned. Thousands more had died, many by their own hands, victims of a propaganda machine that valued death over surrender. But for those who lived, the experience shattered a carefully constructed worldview. They had been taught that the enemy was inhuman. Instead, they discovered their enemy was disturbingly, uncomfortably human. And that realization changed everything. The camps on Saipan remained operational through the end of 1944 and into 1945. As the war progressed and American forces captured more territory, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the number of Japanese civilians in Allied custody swelled into the tens of thousands. Each new wave brought the same cycle: terror, confusion, disbelief, and gradual acceptance. The women of Saipan became unintentional ambassadors. Some were transferred to larger facilities where they encountered newly captured prisoners. They shared their stories, reassured the frightened, challenged the propaganda that still echoed in fresh captives' minds. Their words carried weight because they had lived through the fear and survived with dignity intact. By the spring of 1945, internment camps across the Pacific had developed routines. Schools were established for children. Medical clinics operated daily. Work programs allowed prisoners to earn small wages or trade goods. Cultural practices, tea ceremonies, Buddhist prayers, traditional festivals were permitted and even encouraged by camp administrators who understood that preserving identity helped maintain morale. This was not universal kindness. Policies varied by location and commander. Some camps were harsher than others. Resources were limited. Mistakes were made. But the overarching framework remained consistent. Treat prisoners humanely. Maintain order through respect rather than fear, and prepare for an eventual post-war world where these people would return home. The war ended in August 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender. For the women in the camps, the news brought complicated emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, grief for what had been lost, uncertainty about what came next. Japan was devastated, occupied by the very forces that had once been called demons. What world were they returning to? Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Ships carried thousands of civilians back to Japan, many returning to cities that no longer existed, families that had been scattered or destroyed. The journey was long, uncomfortable, and filled with anxiety, but they were alive, and that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. When the ships docked in Japanese ports, the returning women faced a new challenge: explaining their survival. In a culture that had valorized death over surrender, those who lived carried an invisible stain. Some families welcomed them with open arms, grateful for their return. Others were colder, ashamed that their daughters or sisters had not chosen the honorable path. One woman, returning to Hiroshima in early 1946, found her childhood home reduced to ash. Her parents were gone, her siblings scattered. She stood in the ruins and realized that survival had been the right choice, even if it meant carrying the weight of judgment. In the years that followed, many of the women who had been prisoners rarely spoke of their experiences. Japanese society was rebuilding, focused on recovery and reconciliation with the occupying American forces. Stories of captivity, especially those that contradicted the wartime narrative of American brutality, were uncomfortable. They challenged the myths that had justified so much suffering. But silence could not last forever. By the 1970s and 1980s, as Japan underwent cultural shifts and younger generations began questioning the war, historians started recording oral testimonies. Women who had been prisoners came forward, cautiously at first, then with increasing openness. Their accounts painted a complex picture, not of an easy captivity, but of one that defied everything they had been conditioned to expect. Hatsuko, the mother whose infant had been saved by the Navy corpsman, gave an interview in 1983. She was in her 60s, a grandmother, living in Osaka. She spoke of the moment her son was returned to her. "I had prepared myself for his death. I thought it was my punishment for surrendering. When the American doctor gave him back to me, alive, I did not understand. It took me years to realize that they saw him as a baby, not as an enemy." That distinction saved his life. Her son, now a businessman, sat beside her during the interview. He owed his existence to that distinction. Kim Sun-hee, the Korean woman who had spoken bluntly in the camp, became an advocate for reconciliation between Korea and Japan. She testified before government panels about her treatment under both Japanese and American forces, providing a nuanced perspective that challenged nationalist narratives on all sides. She died in 1991, her testimony preserved in archives used by scholars studying the Pacific War. Fumiko, the schoolteacher, returned to teaching after the war. She never spoke publicly about her time in the camp, but her students later recalled that she taught them to question propaganda, to seek truth beyond official narratives, and to recognize humanity even in enemies. One former student, now a professor of history, said, "She taught us that the greatest lies are the ones that make us fear other people's humanity." The long-term impact of these experiences extended beyond individual lives. The treatment of Japanese prisoners by American forces became a quiet counterpoint to the brutality that defined much of the Pacific War. It did not erase the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs, or the suffering inflicted on both sides, but it demonstrated that even in total war, moments of humanity were possible. Post-war U.S.-Japan relations benefited from these stories in subtle ways. As Japan transitioned from enemy to ally during the Cold War, the shared memory of humane treatment, however imperfect, provided a foundation for trust. Veterans from both sides met in reconciliation ceremonies. Former prisoners corresponded with former guards. Wounds did not fully heal, but they began to close. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a group of Saipan survivors returned to the island. They visited the camps where they had been held, now overgrown with jungle. They stood at Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, placing flowers for those who had not survived. And they met with American veterans who had been there in 1944. One woman, speaking through a translator, addressed a room of elderly Marines. "You were the enemy. We feared you. But you showed us kindness when you did not have to. You gave us back our lives. We did not forget." A Marine, tears in his eyes, replied, "We were just trying to do the right thing." I'm glad it mattered. It did matter. More than orders or policy or doctrine, those small acts of dignity, offering water, treating wounds, respecting boundaries, keeping promises, had mattered. They had saved lives, and they had planted seeds of understanding that grew across decades. War reveals the extremes of human nature, both its capacity for cruelty and its potential for grace. The women who emerged from the caves of Saipan in July 1944 had been taught to fear monsters. What they found instead were men, flawed, tired, sometimes uncertain men, who chose to see them not as enemies, but as people. That choice, repeated in thousands of small moments across internment camps in the Pacific, challenged a narrative built on dehumanization. It did not undo the horrors of war. It did not erase the cities burned, the lives shattered, the families destroyed. But it proved that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity could survive if someone chose to protect it. The story of these women is not about American exceptionalism or Japanese victimhood. It is about the power of unexpected kindness to shatter lies. It is about the courage required to survive when survival itself is considered shameful. And it is about the long, difficult work of reconciliation that begins when enemies recognize each other's humanity. Decades later, the children born in those camps, the mothers who made impossible choices, and the soldiers who extended hands instead of weapons, they all carried pieces of the same truth, that war's greatest tragedy is not just the destruction it causes, but the lies it requires us to believe about each other, and its greatest hope is that, sometimes, those lies fail.